Our tale of John Coad, soldier, rebel, traitor, and now survivor continues. He has been wounded during the Monmouth Rebellion, captured, imprisoned, sentenced by Judge Jeffreys, and is now captive on board a ship. He is bound for Jamaica, bound to perhaps end his life in slavery. On the 17th of October 1685, barely 3 months after the Battle of Sedgemoor, Coad finds himself leaving England. As the anchor is pulled up and the town of Weymouth begins to grow smaller, he asks that his wife, children, relations and estate are put under the protection and providence of God. But even as he prayed to the Almighty, he was under no illusion that due to his wounds, the loss of blood, his fever and long imprisonment, he might never actually see land again. Yet despite his desperate situation, he was still grateful that he had escaped a terrible death, either by hanging, beheading, or the dreaded hanging, drawing and quartering. But as we shall see, he was still fearful of being in the hands of a most bitter enemy, the ship's master. Conditions on board ship would seem no better than slaves from Africa would have been subjected to. 99 were trapped under deck, with not enough space to lie down without sleeping on top of another inmate. There was also no thought of escape, as every hatchway was guarded by surly men armed with hangers and blunderbusses. The men to begin with were not allowed on deck, and to perform their basic functions, the master supplied a vessel which was sat in the midst to receive the excrement. Coad writes, the ship was soon infected with grievous and contagious diseases. Smallpox, fever, calenture, a feverish delirium formerly thought of as afflicting sailors in the tropics, the plague, and frightful botches. By the time this plague ship arrived in the West Indies, 22 out of 99 passengers had died, including many of the crew and the free passengers. These other deaths included the master's mate and one Esquire Lynch. In this hardest prison, where men lay crying and dying, Coad's indomitable faith still managed to keep him going. He writes, I was let down again into the valley of the shadow of death. Yet the Lord was my life, my comfort, my hope, my strength. His rod and his staff comforted me. For though we could not look out for strength, we could look up. It would appear that Coad became almost a religious leader during this vile voyage. The captives would have needed much encouragement to keep their spirits up, not to mention the will to fight the infections that were all about. We prayed and sung praises to God in our dark dungeon. He was the light around us. Objects of pity we were, and arguments from misery to mercy. We had enough in the day to behold, the miserable sight of botches, pox, others devoured by lice, till they were almost at death's door. It is impossible to visualize the appalling conditions these badly dressed, cramped, hungry and frightened men had to contend with day in, day out. Perhaps some wished they had met their end quickly on the gallows, rather than suffer the daily degradations of their imprisonment. Night-time brought no relief from their suffering. Night brought the fearful groaning of the sick, who could not rest, but tumbled over the rest, distracting the whole company. Coad points out that at the mount of their straits, God was seen, and let the healthier men above deck, for if he had not, all would surely have fallen. The fresh air, space, and a little exercise would have worked wonders for the men, as well as some of the crew, who would secrete their provisions to satisfy our hunger, which was another of our miseries. We must remember that the crew may well have sympathised with the causes the prisoner had fought for. However, the provisions only went so far, for Coad's nemesis, the wicked wretch of the sailing master, would not allow us provision enough, even though there was plenty to go around. Whether the master wanted to keep the men underfed, so they would be too weak to attempt to break their bonds and take over the ship, or he just did not care, is open to conjecture. But it would appear that the master would have been paid for every slave that arrived in Jamaica, safely and fit enough to work. So when Coad complains that on many days there was not enough food from 5 men's messes to satisfy 1 man, added to this, the water was exceedingly corrupt and stinking and scarce. It would appear that the master did not care to the survival of his human cargo. The lack of drinking water must have only added to the suffering of the imprisoned men, especially as the ship sailed through hotter climates, although Coad did mention that the ration of small beer when land came in sight was very welcome. As the journey continued across the Atlantic in their cramped and stifling conditions, Coad again writes of the sinister master of the ship. Having terrorised and abused his captives, forwarding their embittered and afflicted condition, he suddenly had to call the inmates for help. The ship was in peril. Being hit by a storm in the middle of the Atlantic, the crew could not expect any help from other ships, and had to rely on those on board, including the weak and diseased prisoners. During the storm, mainstays had parted, and the ship began to veer dangerously to port, bringing her broadside onto the careering waves. Due to the valiant efforts of all on board, the ship was brought about and the stays repaired. But as soon as the danger was past, Coad notes the master's heart hardened almost immediately. Yet justice would appear to have played its part in the final years of the master's life. Having arrived in Jamaica, many men gave evidence against Master Edward Brooks. In Port Royal, merchants would not freight his ship, and he supposedly spent a long time being forced to chop firewood in a Spanish bay. When finally he returned home, he ran aground on the Irish coast, losing his ship. To make matters worse, he returned to find his wife dead, his young children destitute, his business lost, and himself ruined. Coad summed up the fate of Master Brooks. God that ruleth in the earth, his cursing us came down upon his own head. Returning to the days and weeks after the storm, Coad writes that the weather became calmer, and were only becalmed once as the ship passed through the Tropic of Cancer. He also states that they saw neither friend nor enemy as the waves slipped under the keel. As time wore on, unbelievably once more, Coad's health continued to improve. I was wounded, but the Lord healed me. I was weak, but the Lord strengthened me. When young men and strong men were taken down, I was raised up, and do yet live in his fight, though many were taking off in death. As the grey depths of the Atlantic faded into the emerald shallows of Port Royal, he records, "In my fiery trial I was not burnt. In the water, the great and vast ocean, I was not drowned, even after a voyage of 6 weeks and 3 days." So John Coad has been torn from his homeland and his family. He continues to survive despite the many perils he has faced. He is about to leave the wicked clutches of the evil shipmaster, but he still faces a life in chains. In our next instalment, we shall see what happens to John Coad as a slave in Jamaica.